So then we are coming to our lecture series of the ERA chair in e-governance and digital public services. So I'm very happy to welcome you today and to announce to you our speaker, the Professor Rune Halvorsen from Oslo Metropolitan University. And Rune is a professor in sociology and social policy and program director of the master program in international social welfare and health policy at Oslo Metropolitan University. And his central concern is to contribute to new knowledge for the future social Europe. And with that, also his main interests are European and comparative welfare policy, social citizenship movements, and voice in the welfare state. His research projects were on active citizenship, poverty, disability, youth transitions, and theoretization of structure, agency dynamics in the welfare state. Rune, you're going to talk today to us about digitalized social services and how they contribute or hamper social citizenship. So without any further ado, Rune, I would suggest that you probably will take the floor right away and introduce your topic in an even better manner than I could ever do it. I think what we agreed before, also for all the participants, is that we will take the questions live. So whenever they come up, and then Rune, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you see the screen now?
Yes, we can see your PowerPoint screen, but if you could change into presenter mode, yes, and make the video small, because otherwise we will have a black window on our. Yes, this is perfect.
Very good, and thank you so much for having me. I'm Rune Halvorsen. I'm now also the co-director of a newly established research center here at Oslo Metropolitan University, a research center for digitalization of public services and citizenship. And it's a center that is still in the making. And the main hypothesis we are working with in the CEDIC Research Center is that digitalization of public services may foster opportunities for human flourishing and the exercise of full and effective citizenship. Whether and in what way these hypotheses may be true is not yet known, but a central assumption is that social inequality or social inequalities may prevent digitalization from enhancing human flourishing. So one important question is to understand under which conditions digitalization of public services is more likely to foster human flourishing and opportunities for exercising citizenship. So the overall questions I'm asking here today is, do digitalized public services foster or hamper the exercise of social citizenship? And this presentation is more an outline of an analytic framework and identifies some questions for future research rather than to try to answer this question as such. So I will start by elaborating a bit more on the main research question and hypothesis, and say something more about the background, then go more into detail about the analytic framework. And I will use the case of disabled people to illustrate some of my points before I have some more concluding comments and identify some tasks for future research. So some of you may have come across the film I, Daniel Blake. This is a film about citizens' encounters with public welfare in the UK. And the film illustrates very poignantly how issues of unemployment, health conditions, poverty, and the digitalization of social services are interdependent, and how in the film we also see how the main character, Daniel Blake, also struggles to try to learn and understand the digital services and solutions and platforms he is expected to use to register as an unemployed and to receive help and assistance from the public welfare offices in the UK. And as you can imagine, it does not go very well. But as I'll mention, we are interested in how and under which conditions digitalization of public services is more likely to foster human flourishing and opportunities for exercising social citizenship, even for persons at the margins of society, if you want. So what do I have in mind with social citizenship? I rely on a broadly accepted definitions of social citizenship in the literature today. Being a full and equal citizen is basically a question of practices. Living a decent life in accordance with the prevailing standards in society, being able to act autonomously, being able to participate in social and political life in a broad sense, and having civic orientation to the political community and one's fellow citizens. So it's not only about people's entitlements to our social rights as such, but also to what extent people are actually able to participate in all aspects of social life, and also are able to have an influence of decisions of importance to themselves. So, so my colleagues and myself, we have distinguished between, broadly speaking, the main dimensions of social citizenship, namely the security dimension, to what extent people actually are able to use the social rights, and to what extent these social rights actually protect them against major life risks such as unemployment or impairments or disabilities, but also to what extent these public services enable people to choose what kind of life they want for themselves and to live autonomously, to live independently, and make their own choices what they believe is the best for themselves. This is also related to people's opportunities to have influence on the services or to have a voice in negotiations with staff in the public services. And one question here is how and to what extent do the claimants of public services and beneficiaries of public services experience that they have an influence on the services when they are communicated through digitalized platforms. So let me say a bit more about the background for raising these questions. First, European welfare states are undergoing unprecedented structural transformations with increasing digitalization of public services, such as in communication with the schools, with the social services, such as the unemployment exchange offices, or social pension offices, and so on. So these technological transformations have the potential to relocate life chances in ways that are likely to be asymmetrical in terms of who are able to benefit from them. Some scholars claim that digital transformation entails a paradigmatic shift, leaving citizens a new and more active role vis-a-vis the public sector. Digitalized public services can provide better monitoring of eligibility criteria, the application processes and outcomes. Digital platforms have the potential to make information about social services more available to the public and provide more cost-effective, standardized and automatized assessment of applications for services in cash and in kind. Interactive digital technologies can provide bilateral communication channels for claimants and clients of public welfare services to communicate with decision makers, for instance, through chat solutions. While digitalization has potential benefits to government agencies, there are also risks of exclusion and widening of social inequalities. We know that the level and quality of household digital assets is closely tied to country or regional levels of digitalization of public policies. And governments have been aware of the need to identify policies to address the social, economic, and cultural transformations resulting from digitalization. But these policies often focus on issues of connectivity and digital assets, that is, access to the hardware or the digital skills in the population to use these kinds of software. And here is a table that demonstrates some of the developments or progress between 2015 and 2020 in EU government services for selected European countries. So here we find, for instance, Estonia very high up in European relative to other European countries, together with Spain, while countries such as Hungary are much lower on this index. Unfortunately, the DESI index does not cover Norway. But we also know that in addition to these quantitative differences, we also know that there are also social inequalities within countries in the take-up and use of digital solutions. Mobile phones are the most evenly distributed, and fixed broadband connection seems also to be relatively not so much associated with income or dependent on people's income level. But it's close relation between per capita income and internet usage. Although other factors affect internet usage, such as age and literacy and education, the ability to pay for ICTs is probably still one of the most important factors. And here employment seems also to have an independent effect on digital literacy and availability of ICTs. And furthermore, access and usage of ICTs are divided across a number of intersectional dimensions related to gender, class, age, ethnicity, disability, and region. Some countries are making innovative inroads to address these problems, but this action seems still to be fairly fragmented and poorly coordinated, and not systematically pursued, at least for all these population categories. We're beginning to understand some of the causes for digital divisions, but have more limited knowledge about effective policies to combat the digital divides for various countries and communities. Digital deficits are quite fragmented and difficult to compare within and across countries. So while there are some interesting aggregate data on the digital divide related to the connectivity, skills, and usage, these are not well linked to micro-level data, and we still miss information to better understand people's practices and experiences and use of digitalized public services. It is particularly difficult to understand how these assets and deficits accumulate in particular types of households across intersectional differences, and how this varies between countries. And this gap in our knowledge presents significant challenges for both governments and civil society organizations. And effective solutions to bridge these digital divisions and increase citizens' abilities to connect to digital infrastructures is a major challenge to economic growth and social cohesion within and beyond the European Union. Let us now look at how we could possibly deal with and try to frame research into these disparities in use and take-up of digital public services. One possible approach could be a so-called capability approach. And here, one of the most prominent contributions to this approach or perspective is developed through several decades by the Indian economist Amartya Sen, and also we find people or scholars like Martin Nussbaum, obviously, as an important scholar in this strand of the literature. So for Amartya Sen, development or human development consists in the removal of various types of unfreedoms that leave people with little choice and little opportunity of exercising their recent agency. And for him, a key concern is to remove substantial unfreedoms to ensure to foster positive freedoms for people. And potentially, we could argue that digital solutions can have a role in contributing to positive freedoms and opportunities for choice for people, or in the vocabulary of the capability approach, so-called to provide so-called capabilities. The capability approach provides important conceptual tools for how one can better understand the agency structure dynamics in transitions from education to employment, and also in critical stages of the life course. And for instance, to understand also better how persons with disabilities can make use of and profit from these solutions. In brief, this approach distinguishes between capability inputs, the capability set, achieved functions, conversions, and agency. The capability inputs are the resources individuals can avail of in their efforts to live the life they want for themselves, such as money, material resources, and services. The potential transformation of capability inputs into capabilities is mediated by conversion factors, just as the structure is constraining or facilitating conversion. And finally, functionings refer to what people actually do and are. The capabilities and the capability set that knows what people really can do and can be if they want to. So functionings then are a subset of the capability set. So the capability set represent the choices people actually have, and the functionings refer to what people actually choose to do. So they are the realized options of life chances of the individual. And Crocker and Robbins, they argue that the ideal of individual and group agency plays an important role in Sen's way of addressing capability selection, weighting, and sequences. And in his early writings, Sen argued that agency freedom is freedom to achieve whatever the person as a responsible agent decides he or she should achieve. And later, Sen has argued in favor of an agent-oriented view in which individuals and groups should decide by themselves which capabilities and functionings are important to them. And in other words, when it comes to the role of digitalized public services, the question is, to what extent are people with different individual needs and different individual capacities able to make use of those services? For instance, depending on their physical condition, their gender, their reading skills, or even in intelligence or disability. But then the question is, to what extent are there actually in place public policies, practices that or power relations that foster or hamper the development of digital services, and to what extent do people have resources in their social network, in their family, or among colleagues at work to improve their digital skills and to purchase and be able to use those services. And finally, the actual infrastructure or the design of the digital services in itself is of course also important. To what extent are the services designed in a way that are user-friendly and able to possible to use for as many people as possible. So to promote the use of digital services and digital public services, you can imagine 3 different types of policy approaches. First, that we ensure that people actually can afford to use the digital solutions and that they are available to people. For instance, that people actually have can afford to have a computer or a laptop, or and to ensure that people have mobile phones to access the services. And also to what extent people have access to training in use of the equipment and the digital solutions through training provided by the social services or by the education system. But also, and not least important, to what extent the market is regulated through different types of social regulation, such as to ensure accessibility of and usability and user-friendliness of the services. And here it's a question about to what extent do actually the government have in place legislation and other policies to foster accessibility and usability and user-friendliness of the digital public services. Also, when we study this field, it can be it's made more complicated by the fact that the policies in these fields are typically developed in a multi-level governance context. So it's not only the national governments that plays a role in developing these policies and developing these services. We also have policies developed at the UN level, for instance, through the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It addresses access to digital solutions for persons with disabilities. And at the regional level, we find also different policies at the EU level, such as the GDPR, the European Skills Agenda, but also the Web Accessibility Directive for persons with disabilities. And these supranational policies are supposed to be transposed and implemented at the national level, but they're also very much dependent on what happens at the implementation level, at the subnational level, in the municipalities and in the local provision of services to the citizens. And at least in Norway and other Nordic countries, the municipalities are generally very important in providing the actual services to have, and they have the most contact with the citizens when they have need for contact with the public authorities. So in contact with regarding school parents, when they have communicate with schools, and when they are in contact with the unemployment offices or the social security offices. All this is typically organized at the local level. And additionally, we find that there's also different types of actors that are involved in the promotion of digital freedom. There's a multi-actor need for multi-actor coordination between the market, the public authorities, the family, and organized civil society. And especially today, when with the provision of digitalized public services, many of these digital platforms, they are in practice developed and maintained by enterprises, commercial enterprises, so the public authorities also depend on their communication with market actors in the provision of these services. If we now look at more closely at the case of disabled people, as I already hinted at, in 2006, the United Nations adopted the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, which covers both prescriptions against unfair treatment and also more substantial substantive rights. And second, since the mid-1990s, the European Union has developed a social regulation policy to ensure equal treatment of all, independent of disability or impairment, very much inspired by the United States. So at the UN level, we find the so-called UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, which outlines 4 different approaches to promote e-inclusion or e-accessibility. First, through the promotion of universal design, that is, to design environments, facilities, products, and services to make them usable by all people to the greatest extent possible, and hence to minimize the need for particular adaptations or special designs. And second, through the facilitation of reasonable accommodation, that is, necessary and appropriate modifications or adjustments of social environments to meet the needs of individuals with disabilities when the needs arise. And third, the Convention also refers to usability, whether the facilities, products, or services a person with disabilities have access to fully serve the purposes or functions they are meant to serve. And fourth and finally, the Convention also refers to the question about availability, whether the products, facilities, or services we talk about actually exist and are relevant for the lives of individuals with disabilities, or whether such products, facilities, and services are unavailable to economic or other reasons. So the question is, of course, how and to what extent are these principles or approaches actually transposed and implemented by the countries who have ratified the UN conventions. And clearly, the parties to the convention have very different economic conditions and opportunities to realize the visions of the convention. But for the Nordic countries, who are all relatively prosperous and have are well placed to realize the convention, the UN expert committee and advisory experts have reasons to have high expectations to what the Nordic countries should be able to achieve in this regard. And also the European Union has also signed on to this convention. But even before this, the European Union started to develop their own disability rights policies. And they have 3 main achievements, I would say. First, the Employment Framework Directive, which establishes a general framework for equal treatment in employment and occupations, among others on grounds of disability, and it excludes also a provision on the right to reasonable accommodation, including reasonable accommodation of ICT at the workplace. And second, and particularly relevant in our context, is the Web Accessibility Directive. And under this directive, member states must ensure that websites and mobile applications or public sector bodies are more accessible, particularly for people with disabilities, by making them perceivable, operable, and understandable and robust. And finally, and more recently, the European Union has adopted the so-called European Accessibility Act, which requires member states to ensure that products must be designed and produced in such a way as to maximize the foreseeable use by persons with disabilities. And this more recent directive is still in the process of being transposed, and the member states have a deadline until the next year to do so. Then there will be a period until 2030 for the member states to implement this directive. So clearly, and again, clearly, the member states in the EU have different preconditions and policy additions, and backgrounds for that makes them place them in different positions to actually realize and follow up these EU initiatives. If we look at the Nordic countries, the Nordic countries have some particular features that make them distinct, and especially if we compare them with more liberal countries such as the United States. In a paper several years ago, I made an exercise where I tried to compare the early e-accessibility policies in the United States and the Nordic countries. And I found that the United States and the Nordic disability protection systems appear to have contrasting advantages and disadvantages when it comes to the promotion of e-inclusion. The United States has been leading the way in adopting statutory accessibility requirements or social regulation of ICT for employers and the providers of goods and services. And especially important in this context was the adoption of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which set the standards and became a model later, few years later, for the British Disability Discrimination Act adopted in the UK in 1995, and also was an inspiration for what the later discussion in the European Union about the need for more social regulation of accessibility to ICT and to goods and services more generally within a EU context. Now, the Nordic countries, on the other hand, have developed relatively generous national systems for the distribution of assistive technology and the provision of practical assistance and education and economics to support the persons with disabilities to ensure that they can have access to and be able to use digital public services. In the language of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the Nordic countries have scored high on availability in the form of practical and economic support to persons with disabilities. For instance, by providing special solutions, assistive technology, and help people provide support to buy special equipment and add-ons to laptops to ensure that they can use already existing digital solutions, while the United States has given more priority to ensure accessibility of digital solutions for persons with disabilities, for instance, by promoting universal design and through the provision of reasonable accommodation to the persons with disabilities. So in the Nordic countries, there has been a large emphasis on so-called redistributive policies. But they have still an unexploited potential in the area of social regulation policies. We still miss proposals for more systematic and especially legal regulation in this area. And these initiatives have typically been met with uncertainty, especially on the part of the business community. And it has been assumed that this will place an undue burden on employers or the market. And it has assumed that will be experienced as an infringement of freedom of the market and the prerogatives of employers and producers, although we do find some emerging findings on contrary in the United States. So in the United States, in comparisons, there have been much more emphasis on what the market actors can do and what the government, and especially the federal government in the US, can require and demand of from employers and the market actors in the US. So in the US, federal and state accessibility requirements to ICT have increased the demand for improved user interface. In the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehabilitation Act, you find the requirements for that the ICT that the government purchases should be universally designed or have solutions for individual accommodation. And by using its market power, US authorities have stimulated the emergence of critical mass of vendors and producers of more accessible ICT. Because since the public services in the US has such a big purchasing power, they have also been able to influence on what kind of technical solutions the software and hardware producers actually provide. And eventually this has not been necessarily a burden on the US businesses, but rather provides them with a competitive advantage compared to the Nordic economies by anticipating the needs and consumer demands in an aging population. And many of the ICT products used in Nordic countries today and also in other countries are have in fact been developed in the US. And also many of the industry standards in this field on web accessibility have first been developed in a American and Canadian context and are now being adopted and transposed to or transferred to European context. But still, as I've already hinted at, we are still left with several unanswered questions. What happens when the UNCRPD and EU policies are transposed and implemented in member states, as I have very different conditions for implementing these policies, recommendations, and directives, but also, to be fair, also of different degrees of interest and different degrees of enthusiasms for these policies. And a second question here is, what is the role of disabled people's organizations and more broadly other civil society organizations in these processes? And also, how do differences in policy traditions and institutions influence the policy reforms and implementation in different countries? And is it possible to identify how different institutional designs and settings influence or shape or structure the policy reforms and the way digital public services are actually provided and implemented in different countries. So to wrap up, I think there are clearly several challenges and unanswered questions that follows from how the what has been referred to as a fourth industrial revolution influence on the provision of public services and the consequences for how people and to what extent people are able to exercise social citizenship. First, ongoing transformations will promote new types of services and service uses, new needs and solutions, and new potentially fruitful ways to cooperation between service providers and public administration on the one hand, and service users and communities on the other, both in the health and social sector, as well as in education. So one question here is, how will the new constellation of service and types of users develop when digital infrastructure cross-cut private and public sector, and the provision of the services is dependent on the co-production of the services by market actors, the developers of the software and hardware, and the providers of the content or the services, so to speak, in public sector. And second, digitalization of public services also is related to and concerns the governance and democracy in the welfare state. Digitalization impacts on the relationship between citizens, politicians, and public institutions, and hence on aspects of representative, but also deliberative and participatory aspects of democracy. For instance, related to how and to what extent service users and claimants of public services feel and believe that have an experience that have an influence or voice in the negotiations, in the communication with public services. And I have argued also that we should have keep an eye on intersectional different inequalities as a cross-cutting issue to understand digital divisions within and across countries. So one task should be to examine whether digitalization of public services creates the conditions for citizens' participation in public deliberation and decision-making processes, creating the framework for their own lives and promoting the common good for society as a whole. In other words, where digitalization foster or hamper voice and influence, A second task is to examine how processes of digitalization influence the provision of public services and ability of citizens at risk of social exclusion to access, use, and benefit from these services. In other words, with the digitalization foster or hamper people's sense of security and autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rune. This is really a fascinating talk. So we already got one question from Vincent Homburg. One of the promises of digitalization is its potential for allowing for integrated, joined up public services, which arguably are the utmost relevance for people with disabilities and perhaps multiple challenges. To what degree do you observe differences between countries, or Nordic countries for that matter, and is that a part of your research program?
So I think preliminary findings and my earlier research in this context suggests that Sweden was, in a Nordic countries, in a Nordic context, Sweden was a forerunner and anticipated some of the developments in the European Union. So they started to develop these non-discrimination or anti-discrimination policies before it had actually been adopted by the European Union. Norway has then typically looked to Sweden for inspiration and followed step by step a few years after Sweden, while Denmark has been much more skeptical to develop or impose, to develop social regulation policies and adopt non-discrimination policies or accessibility requirements, and refer to their tradition for voluntary commitment from the social partners and negotiations between the social partners as a preferred solution or approach to solve any social problems they have. So Denmark has always been skeptical to this policy development also in the European Union. And it's also reflected, I think, in that even if you look back on in history, Sweden has been also the country with the strongest employment protection and in that sense, legal regulation of the market, even from the 1970s, while Denmark has actually been much closer to the United Kingdom in lack of employment protection and have emphasized more so-called flexicurity with a combination of easy to hire and easy to fire people, but also with strong social protection in terms of unemployment benefits. So in that sense, it's, so that in that sense, there are stronger or perhaps larger differences between the Nordic countries than we sometimes believe.
Vincent, would you want to follow up on this? As I saw you turned on your camera, please. Okay, so that was just a misunderstanding then.
No, I can say something about it because it's indeed fascinating to see differences between countries. In my research, I try to analyze the role of privacy regulations that may affect also the integration of services. What do you think? Is there also a role for a recent emphasis on privacy regulations or not? And what are your views on that?
So did you say privacy regulations?
Privacy regulation, yes. Data protection. Yeah. You also mentioned it briefly.
Yeah. GDPR and so
on. Yes, this is something I don't know so much about, or I have not done any research on it myself. I just note from I have more anecdotal experience with working with researchers in different European countries, and it seems a lot that, for instance, the different degrees of trust to public authorities also plays a role in how people interpret and how concerned people are with their data privacy. So that's something I expect will play a role as well. Norway has, Norway typically have a very benign view of the state. So fairly different, I think, from the UK, for instance. So I would expect that this also has an impact on how we interpret and implement the GDPR and similar
regulations. Yeah. You mentioned, oh, Vincent, please. Yeah, and then.
Oh, I just would like to say thank you. Okay.
Yeah. So what I wanted to follow up was your discussion of the UN convention, the CRPD, and I wanted to ask: is that just a political commitment, or is that actually enforceable? And connecting to that, what do you actually think about just political commitments versus actually making something which would actually give also people with challenges an actual enforceable right, for example, for internet access? Estonia, for one, has only put forward the social right for internet access, but is not providing means for its citizens to actually demand universal service. And then later I will go to Ellis then.
So I suppose it's related to the question about to what extent are there enforcement mechanisms in place and monitoring mechanisms in place.
Yeah.
And for the CRPD, it does exist an optional protocol that the state parties can choose to sign on to, which allows individual citizens and citizens groups to raise complaints to the expert committee. Norway has chosen not to open up for that opportunity. So, but nevertheless, there is annual or
review process.
So you have the name and shame mechanism there. That's something, and also the disabled people's movement. They also mobilize around expectations that the government is supposed to live up to. And so now there is, for instance, a discussion with the UN Convention should be transposed into the Norwegian Constitution.
Okay, good. I mean, I guess it then within the UN system, it's only being picked up with the Universal Periodic Review as part of the High Commissioner on Human Rights then, right?
So there is a special panel of experts that is following or reviewing these reports from the governments and also the alternative reports from civil society. And then there are these conferences to discuss with this panel. And then in addition, there's an UN special rapporteur on disability that also has an independent role in this. For the moment, this is Gerard Quinn from Ireland.
Okay, interesting. Ellis.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to sort of like ask you about, you talked several times about multi-agency collaboration, and I started thinking, it's like, what, like when you were doing your studies and surveys, from my point of view, multi-agency collaboration sometimes is something that can make or break a development in this sector, and actually in many other sectors. It's like, what is your assessment? Should the multi-agency collaboration be more like bottom-up or top-down movement, or like which parties should take more initiative in developing this collaboration so that we would get better results? Because I mean, we talk about this quite a bit in different countries, but the implementation could be a lot better and more efficient, right?
So in other contexts, I have argued that sometimes the national governments are asking, well, what more can I do than they already do? But I have tried sometimes to argue that I could turn this around and say that the question is not what you can do more, but how we can involve other actors more. How can you leave perhaps more of the implementation to the citizens and citizens groups and civil society organizations, and involve citizens more in and providing them with choices and opportunities, and foster to a large extent people's own initiatives to stimulate more bottom-up initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, I think I have a quite strong belief in involving civil society and in social movement organizations in the both in the design and the implementation of the solutions.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So you basically think what I'm thinking. Nice.
Okay, then I make a last view into our round of participants. Are there further questions? Mikkel, you indicated, or yes, please.
Yes, thank you for the talk. It's always good to get a bit of a different perspective on this digitalization of the services, because if I always look at it from the Estonian point of view, then I would say that the main, let's say, drivers of these developments have been a wish to gain in efficiency and to provide convenience, but necessarily not convenience to this, let's say, special cases, if I can put it that way. And I would say, as a result, let's say some of these applications or the developments have been done in a way that I would say paradoxically, actually, because efficiency, let's say, is the primary goal, are actually not lowering the barriers for people with disability, probably actually increasing them somewhat. And partially connected to what Roberto was mentioning here as well, because what we let's say seen a bit here is that the service user interfaces tend to be, let's say, for example, a bit more complicated, and previously people need to be a bit more computer literate, etc. And paradoxically, at least in the Estonian case, which most likely is very different compared to Norway, people with disabilities tend to have much more socioeconomic problems, lower income, etc., higher employment levels, and all these kinds of things. So paradoxically, they actually have less, let's say, a lower ability to use these services, which should lower their barriers, actually, access barriers. So there's some sort of, let's say, like, you can call it a bottleneck phenomenon. They would theoretically benefit most, but in reality, we see they have the lowest usage rate. The main driver, I would say, at least in the Estonian setting, has been this desire to get more efficiency or get efficiency gains, and then provide more convenience to people. But as a result, I would say, somewhat paradoxically, the result has been that these applications and this digitalization of the parts have actually not decreased the access barriers, which you said that basically that's what they would do, but increase them, because we have a situation where people, let's say, people with disabilities have lower income, let's say they are at disadvantage in a society, and as a result have less access to these tools. So when more services switch, let's say, fully online or fully digital, it actually theoretically, yes, they would benefit most, but they have the least lowest user rate. So they seem to be actually excluded even more. I would say, or I mean, what is your feeling about that? Because it seems to me, let's say, the more towards Eastern Europe you move, due to the socioeconomic inequalities which we have here, It's actually there might be the opposite happening, which you described for the Norwegian case.
So yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that's at least reasons to be concerned about this. We still also feel this is still a working hypothesis, and it's still something we need and should collect more data about to understand better. So I'm not sure how well documented it is so far, but clearly I think there are reasons to be concerned about new social divisions or new types of social inequalities that may arise from this development, and perhaps along different axes or dimension than we would expect, perhaps. So you have the rural-urban division. You have the age question about the elderly and their abilities to use these solutions. I mean, to become an older person is very much also to become a disabled person. So there's an overlap there between the person being a person with disability and the person and become an older person. You lost your hearing, you lost your vision, and so on. So, and but yes, I also started to wonder if, I mean, the literature on intersectionality has, since the 1980s, pointed to the importance of gender, ethnicity, and all these different types of so-called new social movements or different types of identities people have. And recognition policies, but I've also wondered if we should not also go back to all the questions about social class and class differences in a digital society, and that the middle class and people in middle class occupations perhaps have different opportunities to avail of these digitalized solutions than the people who are working in the platform economy or in low-skilled or unskilled work, or with no or very little education. So I think even if I have here highlighted this literature on intersectionality, I think also it's still valid to bringing the most older classical questions from about class, perhaps. That seems also be gaining new popularity after it, again after the 1970s. Yeah.
Okay, then despite our little action at the very end, I think it was a very nice discussion that we had and a good start for further projects. So Rune, thank you very much for taking the time to talking to us today.
My pleasure.
And we hope that we can develop some of the ideas that came up also into new initiatives. And then thanks to everyone for participating. And yeah, so we also learned a lesson about interactive meetings.